The dinner table was set perfectly, with soft candlelight casting a warm glow over the room. Plates clinked gently as we passed dishes around and laughter filled the air. Mark, my husband, was animated, recounting some story from work, his voice steady and confident. Aaron, our longtime friend, sat to his right, casually sipping his drink, his presence always slightly magnetic, always just on the edge of being too much. As the evening wore on, there was a moment when everything shifted. Aaron lifted his glass, a playful smirk tugging at his lips. His eyes swept over the table, but they lingered on me longer than they should have. There was a pause in the atmosphere, a subtle shift in energy. When his words came, they carried a weight that immediately felt out of place, though he masked it as humor. Mark's reaction was subtle but impossible to miss. His smile stayed, but the corners of his eyes tightened. His hand, resting on the edge of the table, moved slightly, his fingers tapping out an uneven rhythm. I glanced at him, offering a light smile, hoping to defuse whatever was brewing. But inside, I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, the discomfort blooming in the pit of my stomach. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, or so it seemed on the surface. The conversation drifted back to lighter topics and Mark's laughter returned, though it felt more practiced now. Aaron, as always, seemed completely at ease, but every so often his eyes would flicker toward me. Each glance felt like a question, one I didn't know how to answer. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and Aaron had left, Mark's silence hung heavy in the air. He wasn't angry, not visibly at least. But there was something in the way he avoided looking at me directly, in the way his responses were clipped, that made my chest tighten. Aaron's suggestion about the game lingered in my mind, an odd little thing to propose during a dinner like this. It was meant for couples, he'd said, a way to build trust and have fun. At the time, it had seemed like just another one of his whims, but now, replaying the moment in my head, it felt deliberate. Calculated. As I lay in bed that night, the ceiling above me a blank canvas for my swirling thoughts, I realized something had shifted. Not in a big, obvious way, but in the quiet, insidious way that cracks begin to form. Small, almost invisible at first, but they're nonetheless. And once you've noticed them, you can't unsee them. The days after the dinner were marked by an unusual heaviness, like a storm hovering on the horizon. I couldn't stop replaying the evening in my head, particularly that moment when Aaron's eyes lingered on me too long, when his words hung in the air, pushing boundaries in ways I couldn't fully define. I told myself it was nothing, just Aaron being his usual self, pushing jokes a little too far. But the thought wouldn't leave me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. It wasn't just the words, it was how I felt when he said them. The heat that rushed to my face, the flutter of something unnameable in my chest. I hated that it had made me feel anything at all. Mark didn't bring it up again. If he felt the same shift I did, he wasn't showing it. He carried on as if nothing had happened, but there was an unspoken weight between us. His laughter seemed slightly forced, his touch a little more absent. I didn't know if I was imagining it or if he was choosing to ignore what was obvious to me. Aaron, on the other hand, didn't let the moment fade. It started innocently enough. A casual text asking how I was doing. I responded briefly, keeping things neutral. But his messages became more frequent, and soon he was suggesting meeting for coffee, just the two of us. It's just support, he wrote. You seemed tense the other night. I thought it might help to talk without Mark around. No pressure. His reasoning was hard to argue against. He phrased it so carefully, so deliberately, that I couldn't outright refuse without feeling like I was making too much of it. But the idea made my stomach twist. There was a part of me that wanted to go, if only to prove that it was nothing. To prove to myself that I could sit across from him, have a casual conversation and walk away unshaken. I didn't tell Mark about the messages. It wasn't that I was hiding them, I told myself. It just didn't seem important. It was harmless. But the more I justified it, the heavier the guilt felt, pressing down on me with every passing day. Then one evening, as Mark sat on the couch scrolling through his phone, I heard a quiet hum of acknowledgement from him. Aaron messaged you, he said, not looking up. My stomach dropped. I forced myself to respond casually. Oh, what did he say? Something about meeting up for coffee. He's always been chatty, hasn't he? Mark handed me the phone with a small, absent smile, then turned back to his screen as if it were nothing. I nodded, brushing it off with a forced laugh, but inside I felt the walls closing in. It was nothing, I kept repeating to myself. It was harmless. But as I stared at the screen, Aaron's message staring back at me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The morning was quiet, the kind of calm that feels temporary. Mark had left early for a meeting, leaving me to tend to a few overdue chores around the house. The leaky faucet in the kitchen had been on my list for weeks, and when Aaron offered to swing by and help, it seemed practical. After all, he'd fixed things for us before and Mark didn't seem to mind. Aaron arrived with his usual ease, tools in hand, and a casual energy that always made him seem like he belonged no matter the setting. He worked quickly, chatting lightly about his week as I tried to keep busy organizing the pantry, though my focus was scattered. At one point I handed him a wrench he needed. His hand brushed mine as he took it, a light touch that felt longer than necessary. I tried to ignore it, but then he leaned closer, his voice low and deliberate. "You know that kiss meant more to me than it did to you, right?" I froze. The words hit me like a cold wave, stealing the breath from my chest. My fingers gripped the edge of the counter as I struggled to process what he'd just said. His tone wasn't playful, it was too quiet, too serious. I turned to face him, searching for something to say, but the words wouldn't come. Before I could respond, the sound of the front door opening startled us both. Mark walked in, his voice calling out a casual greeting. Aaron straightened, stepping back as if nothing had happened, and I quickly busied myself with a stack of plates. My heart pounded as Mark entered the kitchen, oblivious to the tension that had filled the room. Later that evening, Mark announced he'd be leaving for a few days on a last-minute work trip. I nodded, trying to act unfazed, but my mind was still spinning. Aaron's words played on a loop, and I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. The following afternoon, Aaron stopped by again, offering to help with a few more repairs while Mark was away. I hesitated but eventually agreed. Keeping busy seemed easier than sitting alone with my thoughts. As we worked, the atmosphere grew heavier. Aaron was quieter than usual, his glances lingering longer than necessary. I could feel the unspoken tension between us, thick and suffocating. At one point, while moving a heavy box together, his hand brushed against mine again. This time he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You feel it too, don't you?" Before I could react, his lips brushed mine, tentative but deliberate. The world seemed to tilt, time slowing as I stood frozen, torn between instinct and reason. I pushed him away almost immediately, my voice sharp. "Aaron, stop. This isn't right." He stepped back, his hands raised in mock surrender. "I'm sorry. It was a mistake, okay? It won't happen again." But his eyes said otherwise. They held no regret, only a quiet persistence that made my stomach churn. As he left, I closed the door behind him, leaning against it as guilt and confusion washed over me. I told myself it was nothing, that it was over, but deep down, I knew the boundaries had already begun to blur, and I wasn't sure how to fix them. The guilt had been gnawing at me ever since Aaron left. Every glance at the kitchen, every reminder of his presence in the house, felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I needed to push it aside to regain control over my thoughts and my life. Mark was coming home tonight and I resolved to focus on us. Maybe a romantic evening could help reset things, bring us closer again. I spent the afternoon preparing, throwing myself into the details. A simple but elegant dinner, candles on the table, soft music playing in the background. It was the kind of evening we hadn't shared in far too long. I told myself this wasn't just a distraction. It was a chance to reconnect. By the time Mark walked through the door, I had everything ready. He seemed pleasantly surprised, his tired face softening as he took in the scene. "This is a nice surprise," he said, his smile genuine. I managed to return it, though my heart felt like it was racing in 100 directions. Dinner began smoothly. Mark talked about his trip, the usual updates about work and colleagues. I nodded along, offering small comments where I could, but I could feel the tension in my own body. Every time he mentioned something mundane, his flight, a presentation, even a joke from a coworker, it reminded me how distant I felt from the normalcy of it all. I avoided mentioning Aaron entirely, steering the conversation away from anything that might veer too close to the edge. I focused instead on Mark, on his stories, on the warmth of his smile. But no matter how hard I tried, the unease lingered beneath the surface. Mark noticed. Of course he did. He always had a way of picking up on the slightest changes, even when I tried to hide them. His eyes lingered on me a little too long as I refilled his glass of wine. His smile faded slightly when I stumbled over an answer to a simple question. By the time dessert arrived, the air between us had grown heavy. I tried to keep the conversation light, but it felt forced and Mark wasn't playing along anymore. He put down his fork and leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady and searching. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with concern. I froze, my mind racing for the right response. "Of course," I said quickly, too quickly. "Why wouldn't it be?" Mark tilted his head, his brow furrowing slightly. "You've seemed distracted lately. I just want to make sure you're all right." "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile that felt unnatural on my lips. "Really? It's just been a busy week, that's all." He nodded slowly, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't entirely convinced. "All right," he said after a moment, picking up his glass again. "If you say so." The conversation drifted back to safer topics, but the tension lingered. I knew he was still thinking about it just as I was. As we cleared the table together, his hand brushed against mine, a simple gesture that felt both comforting and painful at the same time. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, the weight of my choices pressed down harder than ever. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that I could handle this, that it didn't have to affect us. But deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that the cracks were already beginning to show. And no matter how much I tried to cover them, I feared they would only grow wider. The evening lingered in comfortable silence as Mark poured himself another glass of wine. The candles had burned low, their light softening the edges of the room, and I felt a fleeting sense of calm. The tension from earlier had eased, though it remained like a faint hum in the background, too quiet to disrupt but impossible to ignore. Mark set his glass down, leaning forward slightly. His expression softened, but there was something deliberate in his gaze that made my chest tighten. "You're sure everything's all right?" he asked again, his voice gentle but probing. "You've seemed different." I managed a small laugh, trying to deflect the weight of his words. "It's just the usual stress. Nothing to worry about." He didn't respond right away, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the table. "And Aaron?" he asked suddenly, catching me off guard. "You don't think he's too close, do you? I noticed the way he looks at you sometimes." My heart skipped a beat, the casual rhythm of the evening disrupted in an instant. I fought to keep my expression neutral, my voice steady. "Aaron's always been like that. You know how he is, he jokes around a lot." "It doesn't mean anything." Mark studied me for a moment, his brow furrowed slightly. "Maybe. He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Never mind." The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. I reached across the table, placing my hand over his. "You don't have to worry," I said softly. "There's nothing to it." Mark gave me a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Before either of us could say more, my phone buzzed on the counter. The sound was abrupt, cutting through the quiet like a sharp blade. I excused myself quickly, crossing the room to check the message. My stomach twisted as I saw Aaron's name flash across the screen. "You looked amazing tonight. I thought you should hear it from me." The words stared back at me, their weight crushing. I locked the screen before Mark could notice and slipped the phone into my pocket, my pulse racing. When I returned to the table, Mark didn't ask about the message, but his expression told me he'd heard the buzz and was wondering. The next morning I resolved to salvage things. Mark had the day off and I suggested we spend it together. We walked through the park, the crisp air and golden leaves painting a picture of tranquility. For a few hours, it felt like old times, just the two of us laughing at shared memories and enjoying each other's company. By evening, the unease in my chest had lightened. Over dinner, Mark leaned over and kissed me, a lingering touch that sent a warmth through me I hadn't felt in weeks. For a moment, it felt like everything could be okay, like we could find our way back to the simplicity we once had. But deep down I knew the cracks were still there, hiding just beneath the surface. That night, as we were settling in, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. I frowned, glancing at the clock. It was far too late for visitors. Mark went to answer, and my breath caught in my throat when I heard Aaron's voice. He sounded casual, friendly even, but his presence felt like a sharp reminder of everything I was trying to bury. Mark invited him in for a quick drink and I forced myself to join them, sitting quietly as they talked. Aaron's eyes met mine across the room, and in that moment, I felt the ground shift again, the fragile stability I'd been trying to build crumbling just a little more. The morning was bright, with a cool breeze that carried the crisp scent of early autumn. Aaron had suggested the idea of a picnic during his visit the night before, brushing it off as a way to relax and bring some levity back into our friendship. It'll be fun, he said, his tone disarming. Just the three of us like old times. Mark agreed, though I couldn't tell if it was out of genuine interest or a sense of obligation. I hesitated but eventually nodded, hoping that a shared outing might ease some of the tension hanging over us all. We chose a park on the edge of town where the trees were just starting to turn golden. Aaron arrived with a picnic basket slung over his shoulder, looking effortlessly casual as usual. Mark and I brought a blanket and a cooler, trying to keep things simple. The afternoon started uneventfully with idle chatter and the faint hum of distant laughter from other families scattered across the park. Aaron seemed subdued, careful not to push boundaries. For a while it felt almost normal, like the version of our friendship we used to have. But as the hours passed, subtle cracks began to form in the facade. Aaron's compliments were innocent at first. Remarks about the weather, the food, or Mark's sense of humor. But then his gaze lingered on me for just a beat too long as he said, "You've got an eye for these things, don't you? Everything you touch turns out perfect." Mark glanced at him sharply, the flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. I shifted uncomfortably, brushing it off with a laugh. "It's just a picnic, Aaron." He shrugged, a small smirk tugging at his lips. "Still, it's nice to see someone who can handle everything with such grace." The comment hung in the air, innocuous enough to be ignored but pointed enough to be felt. Mark didn't respond, instead focusing on his sandwich with an intensity that spoke volumes. I could sense the shift in him, the quiet tension tightening his shoulders, the way his replies grew shorter as the afternoon wore on. By the time we packed up to leave, the atmosphere was heavy. Aaron waved us off with his usual easy charm, promising to catch up soon. Mark said nothing, his expression neutral as we walked back to the car. The drive home was silent, the hum of the engine filling the space where conversation should have been. As we pulled into the driveway, Mark finally broke the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made my chest tighten. "Do you think Aaron's been acting a little off?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "He's always been a little over the top. You know how he is." Mark didn't respond right away, his fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel. "It's not just that," he said finally. "It's the way he talks to you. Feels different. Like he's crossing a line." My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to stay composed. "You're overthinking it. He's just trying to be friendly." Mark glanced at me, his gaze steady but searching. "Maybe. Or maybe he's testing boundaries." I met his eyes briefly before looking away, my stomach churning with unease. "It's nothing, Mark." "Really?" He nodded, but the tension in his jaw remained as we stepped inside the house. I told myself that I'd handled it, that his questions wouldn't go any further. But the look in his eyes as he walked past me said otherwise. Mark decided to host a small dinner at home, something he said was overdue. "Just the three of us," he mentioned casually while setting the date. His tone was light, but I couldn't ignore the underlying tension that had lingered since the picnic. He didn't explicitly say it, but I could tell this was about more than food and conversation. The evening began with an air of forced politeness. I had set the table perfectly, hoping the meticulous details might somehow diffuse the discomfort I knew was coming. Mark was in the kitchen, finishing up the last touches of his signature pasta dish, while Aaron arrived precisely on time as if to avoid any awkward waiting. He greeted me warmly, his usual charm fully intact, but his eyes carried a flicker of something sharper. I tried to focus on keeping the conversation neutral, steering it towards safe topics like work and mutual acquaintances. When Mark finally joined us, carrying a steaming dish to the table, I felt a brief sense of relief. His presence anchored the room, at least for the moment. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier. Aaron's comments, though veiled in humor, began to skirt the edges of propriety. "You've got a knack for hosting as always," he said, his smile lingering on me a little too long. "Mark, you're lucky she makes everything look so effortless." Mark gave a tight smile, saying nothing. I jumped in quickly, shifting the subject to a story about a recent work project, but Aaron's tone carried an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. He wasn't being outright inappropriate, but his words felt calculated, designed to unsettle. By dessert, Mark's responses had become curt, and the tension at the table was palpable. When his phone buzzed with an incoming call, he excused himself, leaving me and Aaron alone. The moment the door clicked shut, the atmosphere shifted entirely. Aaron leaned back in his chair, his smile fading into something more serious. "You've been quiet tonight," he said softly, his voice low enough to feel intimate. "Avoiding me, maybe?" I froze, unsure how to respond. "I'm not avoiding you," I said finally, keeping my tone even. "I'm just trying to keep things normal." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto mine. "Normal?" he repeated, the word laced with something almost mocking. "You and I both know things stopped being normal a long time ago." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He stood then, taking a step closer. My heart pounded as the space between us dissolved, and his voice dropped even lower. "You can't keep pretending this doesn't exist." Before I could react, the sound of Mark's footsteps echoed from the hallway. Aaron stepped back, his expression smoothing into practiced ease just as Mark re-entered the room. My chest tightened as I forced a smile, but inside, I felt the fragile balance of the evening crumbling. The party was loud, filled with laughter and the hum of overlapping conversations. Mark had drifted toward a group of colleagues near the patio, leaving me alone by the dining table. I busied myself with refilling a drink, trying to blend into the background. Aaron appeared beside me, his presence unmistakable. He didn't speak at first, simply standing close enough that I could feel the heat of him. I didn't look up, but I could sense his gaze on me. "You've been avoiding me," he finally said, his voice low enough to be drowned out by the noise around us. I sighed, not wanting to start a conversation that I knew would go nowhere good. "This isn't the time or place, Aaron." He leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear. "There's never going to be a good time for this. You know that." I turned to face him, my pulse quickening. "We shouldn't even be having this conversation," I said firmly, but my voice lacked the conviction I needed it to have. The tension between us was palpable, a thread stretched so thin it felt ready to snap. Before I could say more, he reached out, his hand brushing mine, then lingering. "Just one moment, Sarah," he murmured. "That's all I'm asking." I should have pulled away. I knew I should have walked back into the crowd, found Mark, and let this end before it began. But instead I stood frozen, caught in the magnetic pull of Aaron's intensity. He stepped closer, his hand moving to my waist, and before I could protest, his lips were on mine. The kiss was forceful, filled with all the unspoken tension that had been building between us. It was wrong, and yet I didn't push him away. For a brief, maddening moment I let myself get lost in it. Then I heard it, the sound of a door creaking open. We both turned sharply, and there he was. Mark stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but the shock in his eyes was unmistakable. I pulled away from Aaron, my heart racing as Mark's gaze shifted between us. He didn't say a word, didn't shout or accuse. He simply turned and walked out, leaving the door ajar behind him. The weight of what had just happened crashed down on me. I looked at Aaron, who stood frozen, the usual confidence drained from his face. "You need to leave," I said, my voice trembling but firm. He nodded slowly, stepping back without another word. As he left the room, I felt the walls closing in, the enormity of what had just unfolded suffocating me. Mark hadn't said anything, but his silence spoke volumes. And as I stood there, alone and reeling, I knew that things would never be the same again. The days following the party were weighed down by an unbearable silence. Mark spoke to me only when necessary, his words clipped and devoid of warmth. The once comfortable rhythm of our lives had been replaced by an uneasy distance, and no matter how hard I tried to bridge the gap, it only seemed to widen. I attempted to recreate moments of normalcy, suggesting dinners together, offering to join him on his evening walks, even leaving small notes for him in the mornings like I used to. But his responses were cold, polite at best. The rejection stung more than I cared to admit, but I couldn't blame him. I had seen the look in his eyes that night at the party, and I knew it wasn't something that could be undone with a few kind gestures. Left to my own thoughts, I began replaying every moment of the past few weeks, searching for the point where it all started to unravel. The guilt was a constant presence, gnawing at me in every quiet moment. I knew I had let things go too far, and now I was paying the price. Aaron reached out twice in the days that followed. The first time it was a simple text, "Can we talk?" I deleted it without replying, my chest tightening at the thought of engaging with him again. The second time he showed up at the house unannounced. I opened the door to find him standing there, his expression a mix of frustration and concern. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice carrying that familiar, disarming tone. "I hate that things are like this. Can we please talk?" I hesitated, gripping the edge of the door as if it were the only thing keeping me grounded. "Aaron, I can't do this anymore," I said finally, my voice trembling. "This has gone too far. It's over." His face fell, but he didn't argue. Instead, he nodded slowly, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't give him. "If that's what you want," he said quietly before turning and walking away. The relief I felt was short-lived. That evening, I found Mark sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television. I sat down beside him, carefully placing a hand on his arm. "Mark, I know things have been hard, but I want to fix this. I want us to get back to where we were." He didn't pull away, but he didn't acknowledge my touch either. "I don't know if that's possible," he said after a long pause, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I wanted to argue, to tell him that it was possible, that we could rebuild what we had. But the words caught in my throat, and the weight of his doubt crushed whatever hope I had left. The next morning I woke to find his side of the bed empty. At first I thought he had gone for an early walk, but when I walked into the kitchen I found a note on the counter. It was short, written in his neat, deliberate handwriting. "I need some time to think. Don't call me. I'll reach out when I'm ready." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. He was gone, and I had no idea if or when he would come back. As I stood there, clutching the note, the full weight of my actions crashed down on me. I had pushed too far, crossed too many lines, and now I was left to face the consequences alone.